My name is Polly. I'm the director of the Senior Center here at Horseshoe Pond, and I welcome you all to our monthly American History Lecture Series. It's a real pleasure to have Ralph here today talking about the history of Penacook, aka Fisherville, as I've been reminded. It's a really interesting period of time that he's going to be talking about today. I helped him put together these images on a slideshow for you, and I've already learned quite a bit. So again, it's my pleasure to introduce Ralph Harwood, a historian, and has spent a lot of time recently, especially, looking into the history of Penacook. Thank you very much.
I have a couple of comments about this map. It's obviously contemporary. How many of you have lived in either Penacook or Boscawen? All right, that helps me judge how well you know the area. This is from Google Maps. Can everyone hear me? Thank you. I'm not used to using a microphone. My concern is that I'll speak too loudly using a microphone. Penacook, historically, and certainly the period that I'm talking about when it was known as Fisherville, was what is now Ward 1 and about a mile north of the river into Boscawen. And so this is the Penacook River, a fast-flowing, rather more narrow river, much more interesting visually than the Merrimack. Well, that's my bias, I'm sorry. The Merrimack is a slow, meandering river that naturally forms horseshoes. And so this is the Merrimack. The Merrimack was useful for transportation, but not of much use until you got down to Amoskeag for water power. And so this was the only substantial source of water power for either the town of Concord or the town of Boscawen. And Route 3 has a long history. It's gone by various names. And the northern boundary of Penacook, or Fisherville, was defined by the town of Boscawen up a little beyond here in 1849, when they defined the precinct, the Fisherville Fire Precinct. And so everything south of here was the Fisherville Fire Department rather than the Boscawen one. I think that's all we need to see of this map now. But it should help orient you that this is the way people now go to the interstate. Obviously, this didn't exist in this configuration in the time I'm talking about. Most of these roads did not exist in 1825 or even in 1835. We can go to the next slide. The history of Penacook, or Fisherville, is well documented. There are quite a few sources, rather more than I think most towns have. And this is Liz Hengen's bibliography, a nearly complete one that was compiled for a publication that was mainly devoted to a cataloging of buildings in Ward 1 and published in 1990. It's incomplete in that it does not have the Boscawen town histories, of which there are 4, because Boscawen since 1883 has been doing a town history every 50 years. It also omits the several weekly newspapers that are in microfilm in the State Library, but those are not covering our period. They don't begin until the 1880s. And of the authors, the one that you will encounter the most, and certainly wrote the longest book relating specifically to Penacook, is David Arthur Brown. And he was born in 1839 So he was really a child in the latter part of the period I'm going to be speaking about. But he was the son and the nephew of the two Brown brothers who leased the two mills and managed them, and had a great deal to do with the development of Fisherville. So he had good resources, and he made an effort to draw other people into his book and have them write small accounts of areas that they remembered. His book, at 570 pages, has a lot of material, but unfortunately the organization leaves a lot to be desired. If you are only interested in finding out about bands in town or a particular church's history, it works. But if you want to understand the sequence of events that led to the building of the mills, the creation of the dams, you have to go back and forth over about 20 different pages in 150 pages of the front section of the book, because it is not at all chronological. Another flaw in David Arthur Brown is that he does not relate local events to what was going on in the state or the nation financially or economically. And his book is online. He used the diary of William H. Gage, who lived in the area on the Boscawen side from 1791 until his death in 1872. So that is a primary source that is contemporary. He also reprinted from John Leinen's 1899 publication. Now, John Leinen was only born in 1840 and didn't move to this area until 1852, but he worked as a boy in the factories and had a very interesting life because his father was from Ireland but educated, and they came here, they worked in the factories. This is Leinen later in life. He was the founder of the Irish American Historical Society, the author of several books, and was awarded an honorary degree by Dartmouth College. So in some ways, he's more the professional historian than David Arthur Brown. They were close friends, and both were members of the fire company and of the band. David Arthur Brown is the founder of the band that we now call the Nevers Band, the oldest band in the nation in continuous existence. Leinen is of interest because he began in a working class environment and ended up in a rather prestigious situation in life, having held a number of important state offices. An earlier source, but only a few pages devoted to Fisherville, is Nathaniel Bolton. His History of Concord, published in 1856, is a definitive work for Concord. He was well qualified as minister of the first church in Concord, the first Congregational Church, from 1825 to 1867. He was a first-hand observer of everything that was going on. He was also a president of the New Hampshire Historical Society. And our next slide is of Charles Carlton Coffin, born in 1823 and spent his boyhood and youth in the Upper Village in Boscawen on King Street. Coffin published his History of Boscawen and Webster in 1878 and had a very interesting life. He was involved in surveying for the Northern Railroad, and then he became a Civil War correspondent. After the Civil War, he went to Europe for a year and wrote a book about European politics. published in 1866, at the end of 1866. And in 1867, he took his wife on a round-the-world tour. They spent a year visiting Egypt, India, China, and Japan, and Hawaii. So he is a more cosmopolitan historian, perhaps, than our other individuals. His successor as a Boscawen historian, Buxton, also made an around-the-world tour with his wife, who was a personal friend of my mother in her advanced years. So in the case of Boscawen, we have two historians that were the author of a number of books, travel books and histories. This was, however, a churchless and nameless locale before 1835. What we now call Penacook, and was called Fisherville, had no name and had no church. A few people, very few, mainly the Ralphs on the Concord side, bothered to ride the 6.5 miles or 7 miles to the first church in Concord. More people, perhaps, who lived on the Boscawen side rode the 3 miles up to the Boscawen Congregational Church. Those whose childhood had been within a mile of the Penacook in either town knew one another from their shared schooling. A Union schoolhouse was built over the town line on Crescent Street in 1815. And so from 1815 on, the few families that lived in this area on either side of the town line were in school together. Boscawen withdrew from this Union school district in 1836 because there were so few people living on the Concord side of the line. This is the Chandler Tavern. It was built in 1787 on the Boscawen side at the top of a steep hill rising from the Penacook River. Until 1824, the bridge over the Penacook went by way of Crescent Street onto what's now Eel Street, and then steeply up the hill past this tavern to join what we call North Main Street, what was then Concord Street. And there was no bridge where the North Main Street Bridge is until 1824. This tavern remained standing until the 1930s. And it was a stagecoach stop, and it was the only place where people who lived within 3 or 4 miles of it could gather, there being no church building. As adults, granted, there was a schoolhouse. And so this is the only medium for any kind of social action, interaction, or community sense in this pre-1835, 1837 period. Nathaniel Chandler, the son of the tavern builder, built this house in 1806, and it is still standing at the top of Eel Street. You can see it. It was completely unchanged until last year when the Carey family sold it, and it's now got new windows and new siding, but it still has its essential lines. There is, of course, in Ward 1 on the Concord side, the 1774 Ralph House, which has been unoccupied for decades and now belongs to the Penacook Historical Society, and two other, another Ralph House that is in private ownership that was built in 1805. There were many other houses in 1805 and 1806, but they don't survive. As I mentioned, in 1824, a new bridge was built and Concord Street was extended to link up with the bridge. So what we now know as Route 3 was in its present form. Some other early homes were built near the 1787 tavern on the Boscawen side. But in 1825, when Reverend Bolton arrived in the area as the minister of the First Church, he saw only 5 homes on the Concord side of the line. So it's questionable as to whether before 1835 you would even call this a hamlet. Certainly not a village or a community in the usual sense of the word. Now we have a map of Massachusetts and New Hampshire early brick or stone factory textile mills. The first of the Massachusetts-style factory system mills was built at Waltham in 1814 by the Lowell family, and that developed into quite a large complex. They evolved a new industrial system that was unique to its time and caused European visitors, English visitors, to come to Waltham and to Lowell to see this in action. Because there had been previous mills in Rhode Island and Connecticut, but each mill was devoted to a particular part of the process of making cotton cloth or woolen cloth. At Waltham, the Massachusetts factory system developed whereby all the processes of manufacturing of cloth, from the most basic raw material to the finished product, were done in one facility, multi-story facility. And then Lowell was built in 1820 as a model town, expressing the ideals of the Congregational and Unitarian establishment in Boston. And there was a very rapid spread between 1823 and 1825 of mills. So you get a mill in Nashua, one in Exeter, the Newmarket Mill of 1825, Somersworth 1825, Dover 1823. This is the Middlesex Canal, which was opened in 1803, and from 1803 on allowed transportation from Concord to Boston by canal. This is the 1825 stone Newmarket mills on the Lamprey River. And one of the Newmarket mills in granite survives and is the longest stone mill in the state. These mills would have been known to George D. Varney of Dover, a man of vision who bought a large section of land on both sides of the Penacook in 1824. He built the upper dam on this map. This is a map I drew of Penacook. Sorry, I went out a period and said Penacook. This is where the Penacook joins the Merrimack. This is Dustin Island. So at a later date, the railroad comes right through here. This is my attempt, particularly referring to Hengen's book, to draw out what roads were in existence by 1825. It's apparent there was a road down here because this is where the Ralph family homes and the Ralph barn are, now the location of the 3 buildings that the Penacook Historical Society owns. In 1822, Merrimack Street was laid out. Previous to that, of course, there was the main road, Concord Street, which ran like this, and then over to Crescent Street and up Eel, and here was the tavern. At a very early date, the lower part of Chandler Street was established. There were houses along here. It's not too clear to me if these were really streets. Queen Street has a very early date, and this street has gone by various names: Water Street, Fish Street, more recently Eel Street, and then of course later on in the 1830s and 40s this becomes Commercial Street down here. There is a discrepancy between Brown and our historian Hengen as to the date of Washington Street, so I put them both in. The Borough Road dates to 1760. There was a mill out there before there was any industrial activity in the Penacook area. Varney built the upper dam, which it's very difficult in the histories to determine what dam is being referred to, but I think that the upper dam is here and doesn't exist any longer. Existed in much of the 19th century. And this is what they are referring to as the lower dam. But then again, there is another crucial dam down here which was built at a fairly early date. And I'm not clear how that's being referred to. Varney, I don't really know what Varney called the dam, but in 1878 that was being referred to as the upper dam and was later known as the Penacook Dam. In 1829 he bought the Nathan Chandler House, which you already saw, but Varney proceeded no further with his projects as he became financially embarrassed. Varney's properties here, including the water power rights, passed to the United States Bank at Portsmouth. Benjamin Kimball purchased these properties from the bank in 1830, moving here from Canterbury to the Chandler House in the fall of that year. His eldest son, John, became the railroad man whose brick home in Concord is now known as the Kimball Jenkins estate. He lived in the Chandler House as a boy. In 1831, Kimball built the dam at the lower falls, the dam we still see, obviously in a new form, but in the location we still see, and erected a brick grist mill just south of the town line, which is not standing. About 3 weeks before his death in 1834, Kimball sold his properties to his cousin, William M. Kimball and Calvin Gage. And this is a portrait of Calvin Gage. Now there's a real tragedy involved here because Benjamin Kimball couldn't have been more than middle-aged and maybe even younger. And he dies a year after his youngest son is born. There's no detail as to what he died of, but what he is doing is 3 weeks before his death, he's selling his properties to his cousin and to Calvin Gage, who owns the largest amount of land on the Boscawen side near the rivers. Calvin Gage and William Kimball obtained the charter for the Penacook Manufacturing and Mechanic Company. There was a New England-wide land speculation in 1835, which Bolton begins one of his chapters with. And he tells us that it was mainly in relation to land speculation in the state of Maine, but it soon extended to properties in all the principal cities and villages of New England. Visionary schemes were projected, airy hopes were raised, and extravagant sums paid for land, with the expectation of amassing thereby a large fortune. Now, that may seem rather familiar. Unfortunately, it didn't last. But this is the year in which Francis and Freeman Fisher, Boston brothers, buy all the properties that had been amassed along the river, and the chartered company from Calvin Gage and William Kimball. So it appears that the Fisher brothers in Boston were a bit more prudent than many of the speculators. Instead of investing in wilderness land in undeveloped areas, they invested in an area that had transportation within 7 miles, by canal to Boston. By 1836, the Fisher brothers had had the stone Penacook mill built, and this was the tallest, although not the longest, of the three granite mills that ended up being built in Fisherville. This still stands, but there were so many additions to it that you wouldn't recognize it from the street. And it's not in good shape in terms of its interior. And it's interesting to note that the Fisher brothers gave this the name of the Penacook Mill. Penacook was the original name for Boscawen. On the 4th of July in 1837, there was a dinner and dance in the empty Penacook Mill. And that's described in brown. Citizens met in the morning at the Penacook Mill, then just completed, but having no machinery, and formed a procession. Men with their wives and boys with their best girls, making quite a long line, which marched to Boscawen Plain, thence down to the Merrimack River, where they went on board a large boat owned by Chandler Gage and floated downstream to the mouth of the Penacook and landed near the site of the flour mill. There they met a company from Boscawen who escorted the party back to the Penacook Mill, where they all had dinner, and after dinner had a dance on the big floor of the new mill. To complete the day's celebration, most of the party went to Concord in the evening to see a display of fireworks. Here we see the first store, which was built in 1836 and opened as Johnson & Gage's store, diagonally across from the tavern on the Boscawen side. You will probably know this as Kerry's Market, though it now is a music store. The United States government had retired its debt and had surplus revenue which it distributed via the states. The town meetings of both Boscawen and Concord voted how to use these monies. This is mentioned in both Coffin's Boscawen history and Bolton's Concord history. A nationwide panic ensued in 1837 after the U.S. government had retired all its debt. And that is probably the reason that the Penacook Mill was still empty on the 4th of July. The Depression lasted into 1839. And Coffin, in his History of Boscawen and Webster, mentions that the country was still suffering from the commercial disasters of 1837. There was little money in circulation. Immigration from the east to the west still continued, although the valuation of property on the selectmen's books was unchanged. There had in reality been a great depreciation of values. The only business out of the usual course at town meeting was a vote to make the almshouse a house of correction for vagrants. This was prompted by the unusual number of tramps roaming the country, some in search of work, more to sponge their living out of the community. Brown mentions that only a small part of the Penacook Mill was in use, producing anything before 1843. But typically, he neglects to make any linkage to the state or national economy. Bolton wrote that Fisherville's 1840 population did not exceed 100, not surprising, considering that the mill wasn't in operation. The Brown brothers, John and Henry, moved here from Attleboro, where they had manufactured cotton in a leased mill. They leased the empty Penacook Mill building in 1841. Machinery was brought from Chelmsford and Lowell on canal boats to Concord. The Boston and Boating Company boats were 75 feet long by 10 feet wide and poled by 2 men. At Concord, Asa Gage, a Boscawen side resident, backed his wagons into the water to the side of the canal boats, so that the machines were rolled directly from the deck of the boats to the wagons. That's a quote from Brown. Boscawen's side blacksmith, Warren Johnson, did most of the ironwork in the mill. Here we see some textile machinery. This is a cutaway view in a contemporary atlas of the way in which power was generated using belts. And if anyone in the question period has questions about this, I do have some details keyed to the various parts of the illustration. It's a rather technical illustration, but you can see how a massive water wheel, and some of them were 40 feet high, contained within the building, would be able to produce the power to keep all of those belts in motion and thus keep all the machinery going. And here we see the making of cloth. Basically, a female worker attends a cotton loom, while a male, and the next slide is of a male worker attending to the printing, calico printing of the finished cloth. Now, the Penacook mill was a cotton mill. Both of the mills that the Brown brothers ended up leasing were cotton mills. The Brown brothers opened a store here in 1843, maintaining it until 1855. And that is where the Davis and Toll Insurance Company is now, just south of the Penacook mill. In 1843, at last, this community acquires a name. The nameless locale is now Fisherville, because William H. and Isaac Gage, both of the Boscawen side, petitioned the governor and the federal government to establish a post office. And the post office opened in the first store that had been built adjacent to the tavern. In February 1844, on the 5th of February, a Penacook mill fire was described by Reverend Bolton on page 459. And the fire broke out on the third floor and did extensive damage because, of course, the nearest fire equipment was in West Concord, and the fire companies of Concord's main village also came. Amazingly enough, the local people, with no fire company and no equipment, had made great progress before the arrival of the fire engines. Fire engines in those days were nothing like what we think of when we hear the word fire engine. They were little more than a tub with a pump and hose. And so there was, of course, heavy loss in the upper part of the factory. Now, this is interesting because, you see, if you just rely on the Brown history of Penacook, you miss this, that there were in operation in the factory 118 looms and 4,308 spindles, employing about 100 operatives. So this fire would have been a serious issue for the growing community, and particularly for the town of Boscawen. This was a major tax, a revenue producer in terms of property tax. Brown wrote that the building was immediately repaired and new machinery bought, and the mill was again running in full before the close of the year. I don't think it's a coincidence that within a month, in March of 1844, the Fisherville Fire Company, the Fisherville Fire Engine Company, number one, is formed on the Boscawen side, with the Brown brothers participating and the Fishers Corporation donating the land for a fire station. That was adjacent to what we now would see as the Masonic Lodge, but was the church. And the town of Boscawen contributed $150 toward the $625 cost of a W.C. Honeyman and Company fire engine. And 150 feet of hose cost $90. The 30 members of the fire company voted to call the engine the Torrent. And that remained the name of the fire company in the Penacook part of Boscawen into the 1990s, the Torrent Fire Company. In 1849, Boscawen defined the northern boundary of Fisherville Fire Precinct at the brook at the southerly end of King Street. This is in Coffin. It's history of Boscawen and Webster. The Penacook Manufacturing and Mechanic Company, the Fisher-owned company, began a more extensive development of their property on the Concord side of the river in 1845, where they built a new dam on the site of the original Varney Dam. That is a location, there's no dam there now, is the best way of saying it. It would be west of the Main Street Bridge. You would be able to see it from the Main Street Bridge. At the same time, the Penacook Canal was built. I don't remember the Penacook Canal, but there are people here who do. And that has been filled in, and many younger people don't even know it was ever there. But that's why East Street was originally Canal Street. That canal ran down to the new granite Penacook Mill that was built for the Fisher-owned Penacook Manufacturing and Mechanic Company. And there is confusion in some casual histories that have been written. And if you casually read Brown, you'll get the impression that the Brown brothers built and owned the Penacook Mill. But it's very clear in one part of Brown's history that it was built for the Fisher-owned Penacook Manufacturing and Mechanic Company, which always owned the building, but it was built under the direction of H. and J.S. Brown. That was begun in 1845 and completed the next year. The Fisher brothers apparently were next slide. The Fisher brothers were apparently historically aware because, again, with their second mill, they take the original name of the town in which it was built. And I think that's the explanation of why this mill was named the Penacook Mill. It's the first occurrence of anything in this area that we now know as Penacook being named Penacook. And it's from the fact that the original settlement of Concord in this locale, within a half mile of where we are now, was called the plantation of Penacook, P-E-N-N-Y, Cook, in the early 18th century. On the 4th of July in 1847, the lower floor of the eastern half of the new Penacook Mill was the host of another 4th of July event, as there had been no machinery put into that part. Next slide. The Brown brothers began moving equipment, machinery, from the Penacook Mill into the Penacook Mill. And in 1847, John S. Brown, the younger of the two brothers, and the uncle of our historian, fell and was severely injured. His nephew says that he was crippled for life, but it's apparent that he was up and walking, rather with a cane or crutches, within a few months. But he was impaired for the rest of his life, though he had a very active life as a mill manager. That is the most serious industrial accident that I found in reading through the history It's interesting that it occurred to the man who was the manager, not one of the workers. The Brown brothers' father had been a stonemason, and they came from a modest background. They are a very different kind of family from the Lowells and the other individuals in Boston who owned the Amoskeag Company or the Nashua Company or the mills in Lowell and Lawrence. These were not the Fisher brothers were absentee owners, but only owners of the building. And this is a crucial difference in Fisherville and Penacook's history. The people who were actually leasing the buildings and managing the mills lived right there in the community, went to church with their workers. In that same year that John S. Brown had his fall, Amon Harris arrived in town or village. He was the son of the builder of the first mill in Harrisville, which is still standing, and part owner of it from 1835. In 1847, he sold his share in that upper mill in Harrisville and moved here to the Boscawen side with his wife, became very active in the Congregational Church, a deacon indeed, and built the last of the three granite mills, the Harris Woolen Mill. And here you see it from the river. It was still appeared intact a decade ago. Unfortunately, it's essentially lost. And it was a handsome mill, not overly large, and there was a hope a couple of decades ago that it could be converted and made into condominiums or apartments. Next. Here you see it from the road, from Commercial Street. And the Harris Woolen Mill continued in the ownership of the Harris family and in operation into the early 1950s. Next. This is a map, an 1854 map of the railroads in New England. And you can see there's a fairly extensive network. There was a remarkable growth and improvement of railroads in New England from 1840 until 1850. And by 1850, there were 5 times the track mileage of 1840. There was a rapid progress in locomotive design. As examples, we can look at 2 locomotives on the Nashua and Lowell Railroad. The Lion, which is here, built in 1844, is really rather old-fashioned for that date. It's more typical of the late 1830s locomotive, but there was a rail revolution. In the 1830s, generally, locomotives did not have a cab for the man who was driving it. And so that poor person was exposed to the elements. And here in the Paugus of 1848, you see a remarkable development. And it's got a cab, it's got a more complex and larger arrangement of wheels. It's all in all a much more substantial engine. These engines did not go very fast. Until the 1870s, maximum railroad speed was 30 miles per hour, and the average was nearer 20. Here you see the Amoskeag, and there are 2. You're going to see illustrations of 2 locomotives named Amoskeag, but they are different locomotives. This reached Concord on September 6, 1842. And here we have a passenger car used on the New England railroads in 1840. There had been a substantial change in passenger cars too. The 1830s, they were essentially stagecoaches with railroad wheels attached. This is an 1845 figure from a company in Cambridgeport, Mass, and reflected the latest in railroad passenger car technology at that time. It also was accompanied by this interior drawing. And here you have the coach arrangement that we're familiar with in modern railroads, and a small area with sofas and a washstand that ladies could retire to, particularly if they had children. Ladies were free to be anywhere in the train, but they were given a special area. And in this case, there were upholstered seats, and the backs could be switched, so that if, let's say, 4 people were traveling together, you could switch your back and face each other. Next. And this is an interior of a passenger car of the 1840s. This was published in the London Illustrated News of 1852, and it unfortunately does not identify the railroad. And here we have a rather handsome illustration of a Lawrence machine shop locomotive. And this one from the Amoskeag Locomotive Works. This is an 1856 color lithograph of another engine named Amoskeag, also built at the Amoskeag Works. One of the advantages of trains over the canals was that trains ran in the winter. This is a Courier and Ives from the late 1850s, portraying a New England train in the snow. Granted, a bit difficult getting through the snow, but the trains did run in the winter. The Northern Railroad linked Fisherville to centers of innovation and commerce. Charles Coffin, the Boscawen historian, was employed in surveying the route for the Northern Railroad, which ran from Concord through Penacook and Boscawen up to the Connecticut River at Lebanon, where it crossed a bridge was built in 1848 to link it with the Vermont railroads and the railroads to Montreal. And so as a result of that, Fisherville was now had a direct rail link, although you would have to switch between different rail lines, to Boston and also ultimately to Montreal. The first train of 10 cars carried the board of directors through Fisherville on December 25th, 1846. And this is one of the Northern Railroad engines. Here we have a mystery. This map of 1846 is not mentioned in any of the 19th century histories, counting Brown's 1902 as 19th century. And it appears for the first time in Liz Hengen's 1990 book, The Village of Penacook, an architectural survey. It shows you the 2 mills that the Fisher brothers owned, but it envisions a very different community from the one we know. This is Route 3, the bridge we know, named Concord Street here. The bridge down here, which was certainly there, isn't shown. the one you would take if you were going out East Street to the interstate. We do have Merrimack Street. We have Canal Street, but it doesn't run through. And also, something's wrong with the map here. Canal Street should be aligning so that it comes down here. This street, as far as I know, never existed. Crescent Street, instead of ending here, is brought all the way around. But most importantly, the canal is extended in this vision. And two major mill buildings are located here, surrounded by canal and linked to the river here. Also, there are a lot of cookie cutter house lots. I have no idea why this wasn't brought to fruition. My suspicion is that this was prepared for the Fisher brothers as a marketing device to raise money among Boston investors, and they didn't succeed in raising the money. It's also possible that they discovered that there was a 2 or 3 year late summer drought, and it's certainly true that the Penacook River can be a bit spotty in the late summer. It's possible that they realized that there just would not be enough water flow to support an extension of the canal and more mills. It would be interesting to know if this map, this plan, had ever been seen by either the Concord or the Boscawen Town Meeting, and what input, if any, the Brown brothers had in it. But it seems very curious that the son of the man who leased the buildings never mentions it in his history. Here is Captain Henry Rolfe, who owned a great deal of land, basically everything from the river to High Street and down to the Borough Road, and made his fortune essentially selling off the land in lots. He was not actively engaged. None of the Rolfes were in this building of the bigger factories. But they certainly were successful in passively contributing to the community's development by creating lots. The next image is of Captain John Sawyer. In 1832, he bought the Gage farm. This is another group of Gages who lived on the Concord side. And that property was from High Street west to the borough. A fairly substantial amount, basically the land on both sides of Route 3 and the land that's now the commercial center of Penacook. And by 1840, he had sold off a good deal of that land. He was born in 1798 and died in 1888. He built 3 homes in what's now Ward 1 in the course of his life. 2 of them are still standing, brick houses on Washington Street. And he was a carpenter, so he actually built a number of the buildings in the town. Next. And this is his brick house before it was moved in 1870 to make way for the Exchange Block. So it's now right kitty corner to this on Washington Street. And this is apparently a pre-Civil War view in which you have the Washington House, which Captain Sawyer built in 1847 as the second hotel in the community. And it played quite a role as a gathering place from then on. That's where the doctors have their offices now. The very handsome porches have been covered up by a brick addition. And of course the spire of the Baptist Church. And Hazen Knowlton arrived here in 1846. And he built at least 6 houses, maybe more. He is one of the 31 carpenters listed in Wetherell's FISHERVILLE Directory of 1850. But when he arrived in 1846, there were only 6 houses on the Concord side in the central part. Now, that's not counting the Rolfe houses down on Penacook Street. He is the only carpenter, other than Captain Sawyer, whose portrait we have. We have a number of covered bridges that were built in this era, presumably by the carpenters. The Borough Bridge, that's basically the Washington Street Bridge, I believe. This is what you'd now think of maybe as the East Street to Commercial Street bridges. And that there were a pair of covered bridges linked, you can see here, the two, and then one was replaced by metal, the southernmost of them. And that covered bridge survived into my lifetime. I remember walking over it. Next. This is a postcard I bought when I was a child. And it had just been reconditioned when it was burned by a young arsonist. This was a Main Street covered bridge, and it gives you a good idea of what Main Street looked like by 1860. There had been a lot of development. And here you have the Penacook Mill, and up here you have the Congregational Church. And here you have the Brown Brothers store, right here. You'll notice, too, that there are buildings here that don't exist now, tenement houses that were built. This one is still there, but the others are gone. And another view of the Main Street Bridge. And you can see that there are 2 buildings down here associated with the mills that don't stand, haven't stood in living memory. And you can see Webster Place. Those houses are still there. And the houses on Elm Street, on the hill. Those Webster Place and the Elm Street houses were built immediately following the building of the Penacook Mill. They are among the earliest quality housing in the village. And here you see how open the countryside was at that time. Christian Church in 1843. This is the first time that this area has a church, either a gathered congregation or a building. The Christian Church did not last as a congregation for very long, and in 1848, Alman Harris and the Gages had formed a congregational church and bought this building, which remained the Congregational Church until its merger in the early 50s with the Baptist congregation as the United Church of Penacook. And so it lost its steeple, I believe, in the 38 hurricane, but I could be mistaken about that. And you see it today without the spire as the Masonic Lodge. The Baptist Church is a very handsome building. We know it as the United Church. That is the highest wooden spire in the county. And it was a very ambitious project. The Brown Brothers essentially paid for it. Essentially, the mills built it, the mill income. And they built it anticipating a very substantial growth in the size of the congregation, which didn't really ever occur. But it is rated as one of the handsomest of mid-19th century church buildings in New Hampshire. And I think we'll wrap it up at this point because I want some time for questions.